Hello, and welcome to the Health Advances Precision Medicine podcast, where we talk all things precision medicine, companion diagnostics, and beyond. I'm your host, Gary Gustafson, a partner at Health Advances, and today we are diving deep into the incredibly hot field of MRD, or minimal residual disease. I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Camden Carmichael from our precision medicine practice and Earl Gillespie from our oncology practice. Welcome, guys. I thought a good place to start would be maybe for each of you to give a quick intro and maybe a bit about how MRD has crossed your desk in your work here. So, Earl, do you want to start?
Yeah, happy to, Gary. So my background is in science. I have a PhD in pharmacology. I'm a senior director at Health Advances, working mostly in the biopharma and life sciences tools practice, pharma services in particular. In terms of how MRD's crossed my path, I think most of the times that I've encountered it, talking to biopharma companies who are looking for the best ways to detect and monitor disease in their clinical trials, and starting to think about how they might use ctDNA testing or MRD testing to identify patients in eventual clinical practice. On the pharma services side, it's obviously a hot topic for them. How can they best provide those services, both ctDNA and MRD, in clinical trials in the commercial space to their pharma partners?
Great. And Camden, how about you? I know you spend a lot of time on the diagnostic side. So, quick intro from you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Gary, for having me. I'm Kevin Carmichael, a case team in our precision medicine practice located in the Boston office. I split about 50% of my time between working with biopharma and 50% with specialty diagnostics clients. MRD has been a frequent focus of casework, including crafting business development roadmaps for some large specialty diagnostics players, as well as due diligence work for investors. There's a lot of reasons to be excited about MRD, and I'm excited to discuss today.
Great. So, Camden, let me start with you. MRD can mean a lot of different things to different people. And I think it really comes down to how they're using it, right? And I think we tend to think of it in three categories, right? Early stage landmark testing for that adjuvant chemo decision or not, monitoring during the recurrent setting to intervene early, and then the metastatic setting to switch therapy. But how are you thinking about it? Give us a little more about, how people are thinking about it and what it really means.
Yeah, so just starting at the broad level, minimal residual disease testing refers to tiny traces of cancer that remain in the body after treatment, and this is typically detected via circulating tumor DNA in the blood. And this would allow for detection of recurrence before standard scans. So starting with our first use case, in early stage disease, MRD can be used as a landmark test after curative and intent treatment to guide adjuvant therapy decisions. One great example is in stage 2 colon cancer, where there was a landmark trial called Dynamic that showed that using circulating tumor DNA results to decide on chemotherapy can safely reduce overtreatment. Patients that were MRD negative after surgery could skip chemo with low relapse rates, and MRD positive patients could be triaged to get chemo. Additionally, in the early stage setting, MRD could be used for early detection of recurrence months or even years before it shows up on imaging or with symptoms. And the idea is that patients would be monitored in remission with serial blood tests. And if MRD does become positive, it flags that the cancer is likely coming back, which allows the doctors to intervene earlier. In some cases, MRD assays have shown lead times of up to 6 to 12 months ahead of actual, recurrence that you would detect on imaging. And then lastly, in advanced disease, MRD is used more as a real-time response meter. So if a metastatic cancer patient's blood tumor DNAs drop to undetectable levels, it suggests that the therapy is working. If it rebounds or never declines, that could signal a resistance to treatment. And I think one exciting piece of clinical utility here is the ability to trigger therapy switches early. So instead of waiting for the cancer to visibly progress on a scan as you typically would today, MRD could prompt treatment changes early on.
Great. Clearly a really fascinating and hot space. And I think in probably most of our diagnostic projects, it comes up in some way, right? And the questions of, either we need to get into MRD or how do we get into MRD? We're seeing a ton of investment in this space, right? I think it's maybe not too far to say that specialty diagnostic players see MRD almost as a must-have in their portfolio. So, Camden, can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing here between the partnerships and the mindset of these players?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Specialty diagnostics companies have latched on to MRD as kind of the next big thing in cancer testing. And just a few examples in the last few years. I mean, NeoGenomics, a large oncology specialty lab that's focused on community oncologists, they acquired Inivata for their RaDaR assay. Guardant Health, who pioneered blood-based genomic profiling, developed their tumor-naive MRD test called Guardant Reveal. Tempus is another big player that recently collaborated with Personalis to co-commercialize the ultra-sensitive Next personal assay. And then even large reference lab players like Quest Diagnostics entered the scene by acquiring a startup called Haystack Oncology. And I think in terms of mindset, these diagnostic companies are aiming to be full service cancer testing providers. All of them already do tumor genomic profiling for targeted therapy selection. They offer large immunohistochemistry panels, and adding MRD means that they can support a patient from initial diagnosis all the way through post-treatment surveillance. And I think no one wants to be left out once MRD becomes standard of care. So if you're a specialty diagnostics company without an MRD play at this point, you're likely to get one. You're likely looking to get one fast, either by building, buying, or partnering.
But is now too late? I mean, obviously, there's been a land grab, right? And a lot of the major diagnostic players have some offering MRD wise. Is it too late for some of the players who haven't gotten involved? What do you think?
It's definitely not too late. I think we're still early in the overall adoption curve of MRD. The market is expected to grow rapidly in the coming years. I think analysts are putting it at about 20 to 25 billion by 2030. And that's really because the potential patient volume is huge. You think about some of these high prevalence cancers with substantial recurrence risk, colorectal, lung, breast, prostate. That's millions of patients that could potentially benefit from MRD testing. And I think new entrants still see that there's plenty of pie to share if this truly does become standard of care. Many large specialty labs have a really large customer base in oncology. They have relationships with oncologists already, and they can cross-sell an MRD test relatively quickly once they have it. So even if you're a bit late, potentially leveraging distribution to get into this space.
Got it. So, Earl, I want to come to you because we can never avoid pharma's role in this ecosystem, right? You know, with any new technology that ever takes off, we always see that things really start to take an inflection point once pharma starts to invest. We saw it with comprehensive genomic profiling and liquid biopsy. We're seeing it now with digital pathology. And I think many people feel that what's going on in terms of, pharma's investment here on MRD is going to move the needle significantly. I think we'd argue Natera probably is the front runner. I think they're reporting something of more than 70 pharma partnerships at this point. And the highest profile trial, and I want to dig in with you, although not purely MRD, but it's probably close enough, is the Serena 6 study from AstraZeneca, right? That was a really big landmark study that was reported out at the plenary of ASCO this year. And that first trial making the case that you can change therapy based on a molecular recurrence of disease and see an improvement. So Earl, walk us through that trial. Is it as big as a deal as everybody's saying it is? What are you seeing in terms of that trial?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Yeah, I think it's a trial that's really exciting, and as you said, it's a great proof point, and obviously the more conservative pharma companies that have maybe been just dipping their toes in the water when they see these data, I mean, will start to be thinking harder about whether they want to include these types of either inclusion criteria or endpoints in their trials. So Serena 6, they looked at patients that were hormone receptor positive, HER2 negative breast cancer, undergoing first line therapy, standard AI plus CDK4/6. They monitor those patients every 3 months or so for ctDNA, looking at ESR1 mutations, which I think, as we all know, predict that the aromatase inhibitor is no longer going to be effective. So once they found patients that had an ESR1 mutation but had not yet had a clinical recurrence, those patients got randomized into one of two arms. First arm just had patients continue on standard of care. So they just continue their AI, their CDK4/6 until clinical progression, and then they would move on, most likely to a SERD of some kind. The second arm switched immediately to camizestrant, an oral SERD that has demonstrated efficacy against ESR1 mutations, in addition to continuing their CDK4/6. And so those patients would then proceed to clinical progression and then continue on probably to a more either another ER positive drug or a targeted therapy. The key endpoints here: primary endpoint of median progression-free survival increased 7 months. And then the other endpoint that got a lot of play at ASCO was really the time to reduction in quality of life. And that was actually even a greater increase. So they had the control group showing reductions at 6.5 months in the control arm, and then it was 21 months in the arm that switched to the oral SERD. So that was probably the most exciting piece of data coming out of that trial.
Fascinating study, Serena-6, right? I think it's fair to say that it was probably the most talked about and debated outcome at ASCO this year. I think everybody had an opinion, right? I mean, you had plenty of people saying, what a fascinating study. This is game changing, landmark for the field. This opens the door for, molecular response detection, et cetera. And while all true, you had other people saying, well, of course it was a positive trial. You've got, bringing in an effective drug earlier is naturally going to show a benefit. And while that benefit they showed was great, some people wanted more of a benefit. So, but I think your point on the quality of life is undeniable, right? I mean, that endpoint, either side of the aisle you're on, there's something there that's really benefiting patients. Whether or not that translates into OS, I guess, would remain to be seen. But a fascinating study, right? Can you talk a little bit about the implications you heard? I mean, where are you landing? Where were, some of the conversations you heard?
Yeah, I do think that as a scientific study, it is truly exciting because it is the first large randomized study demonstrating that using a molecular relapse type endpoint can potentially benefit patients. And as you said, the quality of life data really points to a much longer period for those patients in the trial that switched, with a maintaining their quality of life. So that's an exciting result. I do agree that the PFS data is hard to interpret. One point that people did bring up is that the PFS2 data, which is data to the second progression, did not meet the threshold for statistical significance. Although I will acknowledge there was a very strong trend, and so maybe as the data mature, that could change. But the idea that you've burned 3 of your drugs that you want to use in these patients, AI, CDK4/6, and an oral SERD, to reach that extra 7 months of PFS, I think people are concerned about that. Ultimately, I think that in terms of changing practice today, I think we're still not quite there. I think that the costs and the logistical challenge of offering this testing to every first-line metastatic patient in a very large population of breast cancer patients is going to be a big challenge, and you really need a really compelling story. And I think that it's close, but not quite in terms of the results here. I think one other point that is exciting, though, in thinking more about ctDNA testing and where we can make further improvements, the investigators screened about 10 patients to enroll one in the trial, with those inclusion criteria of detecting the ESR1 mutations in patients that did not have a clinical relapse. And given that we know that the number of patients that develop ESR1 mutations in response to the first-line therapy is more like 30 or 40%, it suggests there's still room for improvement in terms of test sensitivity. So maybe, in next generations of tests, we can have a much better ability to identify these patients and affect a greater proportion.
Yeah, fascinating. So clearly there's utility in using MRD to really define molecular eligibility perhaps sooner than you otherwise would for a trial. And we saw that great proof of concept with Serena-6. How else can pharma use MRD in trials? I think one other way would be, right, simply to identify high-risk patients for their trial, right? And there are other tools that can do that today, but certainly MRD positivity would be one. But the holy grail, right, would be as a surrogate endpoint. And we're getting glimpses of that in multiple myeloma. So Earl, I thought you could walk us through, how did that happen in multiple myeloma? The FDA's obviously given some concessions there and recognized it. Where are we at there? And is there potential for that more broadly?
Yeah, so I think multiple myeloma is a great proving ground here for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's not a disease that we can cure right now. So there's still a need to create better therapies, to create better ways to treat patients, to completely free them from multiple myeloma, as opposed to some acute leukemias that can be cured, at least in a good number of patients. The second thing is that trial design and trial costs can be very challenging, especially in early lines of disease, because you have a somewhat indolent disease and a combination of effective therapies that we can use. So the good news is patients, have multiple years before they're likely to relapse, but the challenge for pharma then is you have to follow those patients for all that time to determine if your drug is having an effect. So MRD offers an opportunity to show much deeper remissions and potentially, a time point that's a little bit earlier for event-driven trials. And I think that's been shown in a couple of ways. There's certainly a lot of evidence showing strong correlation between MRD negativity and eventual PFS in a number of trials and dozens of treatment arms. The FDA Advisory Committee voted in favor of the use of MRD as an endpoint in April of last year. So that shows pretty strong scientific backing there. And then the other exciting part is that you have a number of companies. Janssen's run an exciting trial in the maintenance setting. BMS, GSK, and AbbVie have all started trials in either first relapse or newly diagnosed patients using MRD as either a primary endpoint or a co-primary endpoint. So there's a lot of enthusiasm there. In terms of where it goes from multiple myeloma, I think the clear next steps will be for diseases actually like, first-line metastatic breast cancer, where you have a long period of remission, looking for those, ways to make trials more efficient while also hopefully, providing better care for patients.
There are a lot of places MRD could go, right? And from Biopharma's perspective, I'm sure it's very exciting. And, I don't know how you feel, but if Biopharma is not thinking about MRD, they certainly risk falling behind competitively. And part of that is because of what MRD can bring in a trial, right? And the efficiencies and the additional information. Talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing. I know you do a lot of work on the CRO and pharma services front, so you're probably at the front lines of seeing how biopharma is creatively using MRD in their trials. What are you seeing, Earl?
Yeah, there's a ton of enthusiasm for use of MRD in early phase and exploratory studies. I think the biggest thing that pharma researchers have discussed with us when we interview them is that you really get an explosion in the number of time points you can potentially access. If you think about a trial where you're trying to assess the tumor via biopsy, you're looking at one time point as the patient enters the trial, and maybe one time point when the patient progresses or leaves the trial. And really that's the maximum number of biopsies you're going to get to try to see what has happened to the tumor in response to your therapy. But if you think about MRD, that's something where the patient can give blood every time they go to the trial site for a checkup. So you really have, a sequence of time points that you can look at to determine how the tumor has responded to your therapy. So it really just provides just so much more data than one could have gotten, say, 20 years ago. And then I think the other thing is that obviously as pharma analyzes that data, they'll start to find more uses for the technology, because then you can say, aha, in this particular trial, we see changes in the ctDNA 6 months, 12 months before the patient relapses. Maybe that gives them a chance to tweak the treatment, bring on a combination partner, or maybe it gives them a chance to use that as an endpoint in a pivotal study to shorten, and make the study more efficient and cost effective and more effective for the patient.
Clearly a lot of areas that pharma can take this. So exciting for the efficiencies and just scientific impact that we're going to see out of this. So it's clear technology is improving. Camden, I want to turn to you and talk about what this means in terms of adoption, right? Because it does seem like we're in a bit of an inflection point here, where the technology has reached a pretty impressive place, but it really does come down to sensitivity, it seems, right? Especially in that landmark testing setting where you really do need to identify the patients who are likely to recur. And if you can catch most of them, then you can trust the tool. Um, Talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing on the ultra sensitive front. It does seem like, some of the companies you've been mentioning are really highlighting, their ultra sensitivity, and that is ultimately the main currency in this space. But what are you seeing there?
Yeah, I think sensitivity it's a critical metric in MRD, especially for early stage patients that may not have a high tumor burden. And it's important in the landmark use case, but also in the recurrence use case because you want to make sure that you're catching a recurrence as early as possible. Companies are in a bit of an arms race right now to detect that proverbial needle in a haystack, variant allele frequencies that are in the 1 per million parts. And I think some key examples would include assays like Personalis Next Personal. That's a tumor-informed whole genome-based approach where they're looking at sequencing a patient's tumor really deeply and looking at a large number of personal tumor mutations to track in the blood on the order of hundreds or even thousands of mutations. And by tracking so many of those markers, they massively increase sensitivity. Another great example that we've been following is the Foresight Diagnostics. They're a startup out of Stanford, and they have kind of a clever twist on it. They look at phased variants in tumor DNA. Essentially, instead of tracking individual mutations, they're looking for pairs of mutations that occur on the same DNA fragment. And by requiring that those two mutations be detected together, they greatly increase the noise that they're getting and can claim higher sensitivity. So yeah, overall, I think ultra-sensitive MRD assays are all trying to solve the same issues. How do we push detection limits as low as possible? And how do we make sure that if there's even a microscopic amount of residual tumor in the blood, that this test will catch that? Um, and how that translates to clinical utility, I think the great example you had was landmark testing. In stage 2 colorectal cancer, this has served as kind of a proving ground. So you would expect maybe 10 to 20% of patients would be at risk of recurrence. So ideally, after surgery, you could do one MRD test and you would detect all 10 to 20% of those patients, and the other 80 to 90% would be negative. If your test isn't sensitive enough, you might miss some of those 10 to 20% of patients. They'll go home falsely reassured and they won't get chemo when they actually really do need it.
It's a great example. And, if you think about the technology and where we are, many people would say the technology is there, right? In terms of sensitivity, where we're at. And so the question is, well, are we at an inflection point for adoption? You've
Mhm.
got the tools that are sensitive, but the medical community at this point really does seem like they need more proof around benefit before making an MRD part of their routine care. Certainly, the guideline organizations have yet to be convinced in full part. But the companies are still pushing hard. There's a lot of testing going on, much of it not reimbursed. And so the payers are caught in the middle a little bit here. So, Cam, I'd love to hear your thoughts on where we're at with this inflection point between those forces of the technology is potentially there, the clinical utility has not been demonstrated necessarily to the sufficient degree for all clinicians. The payers are caught in the middle. So where do you see we are and where are we heading?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that we're at a critical juncture. I think the key now really is evidence generation. That has been the linchpin for broader adoption, and MRD companies know this. They've been investing heavily in clinical trials and studies to validate that utility. I think Natera has really been the clear front runner here. They've poured a ton of resources into trials. They've launched or supported studies across colorectal, breast, bladder, lung, you name it, like so many different solid tumors. And these are often large multi-center trials. I think the best example would be the Circulate trials in colorectal cancer that are testing different MRD-guided treatment strategies. Many are hypothesizing that that's going to be one of the first trials to help get MRD into guidelines. And that is the ultimate goal of these studies is to influence guidelines like NCCN. In oncology, if something makes it into NCCN guidelines, physicians are much more likely to use it and payers are much more likely to pay for it. And right now, NCCN has not fully embraced MRD in solid tumors. We're seeing some of the first hints. I think just this year, NCCN updated the colon and rectal cancer guidelines to say that ctDNA can be used as a prognostic marker. They list it as a post-surgery ctDNA positivity. indicates it's high risk for recurrence. And that's a positive step, the first formal recognition and guidelines that ctDNA status has clinical meaning. But they stop short of saying you should use MRD to decide on treatment, and they really want to see more data there. So I do think that we're at an inflection point, but within the next 1 to 2 years, I think we'll get some results from several pivotal trials. For instance, the readout of Natera's big trials in colorectal cancer could prompt the NCCN to formally incorporate MRD-driven treatment strategies into the colorectal cancer guidelines. And if that happens, if they enter the guidelines and say use MRD to guide chemo, I think it'll open the floodgates for adoption across many different solid tumors. And I think the reason is that, many oncologists say that if it's proven in one solid tumor, conceptually, they would extrapolate it to other solid tumors in practice. And I think after all, like the idea of ctDNA indicating residual disease is a general one. It's not limited to one specific tumor type. So I do think that success in one will catalyze broader adoption in others.
Agreed. And I want to spend a little more time on evidentiary requirements and what's required here to gain coverage. I think there's a big question, a lot of unknowns, and probably a good example would be looking at Saga Diagnostics and their MRD test that just recently came out of Stealth at ASCO this year. And about a month ago, they announced positive coverage decision from MolDX, which we all know secures CMS reimbursement for them. They're covered in stage 2, stage 3 breast cancer for recurrence monitoring for up to 6 years. So that means patients can get this serially, and hopefully detect a recurrence earlier. I think they showed on average, I think you mentioned 13.7 months prior to coming up on scans. So certainly the clinical validity is there. But the question around clinical utility is one that, I think we all felt would be very hard to prove in the setting of recurrence detection if truly you have to prove that intervening early based on that molecular recurrence improves overall survival. That's a question that would be very difficult to prove and certainly has not been proved yet. But I got a chance to chat with the medical director at Palmetto, and he felt that they satisfied at least the conditions of the broader MRD LCD. So they got coverage, via that mechanism. But I guess I want to ask, and I'll throw out a provocative question. Has CMS gotten soft on clinical utility? At least this example might be one to question. And are they going to be so far away from what the private payers will ultimately require that, maybe this is a situation where you say CMS is good enough, and to fully prove clinical utility would be an enormous trial, and we'll take what we can get. I don't know. Um, but it's a very interesting kind of battleground. So, Cam, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I would definitely say that the Saga news was a bit of a surprise to me at first, but then going back and looking at the LCD for MRD testing in solid tumors, it made me realize like just how strong uh, MolDX is on the clinical validity data. They really will cover a test if it can show that it can detect recurrence way earlier than standard methods, such as imaging. And like you said, Saga showed that definitively by showing that they could detect recurrence up to 13.7 months ahead of traditional screens. But I do think that, there is less of a focus on, full clinical utility trials. I think they're more focused on the implication that if you're detecting recurrence that far in advance, do the doctors have time to make some kind of change that could improve patient outcomes? I wouldn't necessarily say that, MolDX is going soft. I think they are being a bit progressive here. I think they recognize that there's a really strong implication. MRD is a super innovative technology. The results should mean something. There should be an improvement to patient outcomes if we can make some changes. So they're really pushing the field forward. I think commercial payers are more conservative. They're going to follow their traditional route of, you need to show me the clinical utility in trials, then I will pay for it. So for MRD companies, when they're thinking about running these large clinical utility trials, I think they recognize that Medicare coverage is not in game. It's a stepping stone. They will need to continue to run and publish studies to get broad payer coverage. In other words, they're not off the hook just because Medicare has jumped in. They really need to convince everyone else, including both commercial payers and oncologists.
Agreed. But those trials in the recurrence setting, I mean, it's massive. So, hey, hire Cam and have him tell you what the payers are looking for in that setting. And if there's a way to bridge the gap, I mean, between CMS giving you a positive coverage largely based on clinical validity and presumed clinical utility versus maybe the private payers holding out. I might actually say it's the clinical guidelines, to your point, Camden. Like that's maybe the intermediary group that's going to play, the glue there to bring the
Mhm.
private payers on board with maybe more of a realistic expectation on clinical utility or something in the middle. But remains to be seen, and the discussion will continue. Maybe we'll do another session on that next time. But I think we're at time. I want to thank you both for joining. I mean, it was really great to have the biopharma and the diagnostics perspective. So thanks to you both. And I think I'd say to the broader audience, feel free to leave comments, follow questions. Love to hear what topics anybody else would like us to tackle on the next one of these. Um, and again, this is the Health Advances Precision Medicine podcast, and appreciate everyone joining in. Feel free to like and subscribe if you're interested, and we'll see you next time. Thanks all.